All right. It is, hello and thanks for tuning in. This is David Popiel with AIA Colorado. And today I have with me Karl Daubmann, Associate Professor at the University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture and Planning, Creative Director of Blue Homes, and Principal at his new firm, Daub Lab. Mr. Daubmann's work has received national design awards, and he has been a visiting professor at schools such as SciArc and the University of Cincinnati. His interest in fabrication and digital design puts him out front in adapting to the changing role of architects today. Mr. Daubmann's presentation at the AIA Practice and Design Conference, titled Excess Efficiencies, will focus on digital design and fabrication and its role, impact, and influence on design and construction and product delivery. So it is my great pleasure to be talking with him today. How are you doing, Mr. Daubmann?
Great, thank you.
All right. We'll just jump into the interview. So how do you see architecture having changed in the past 5 years or so? And the theme of the conference is the new normal. So what is your new normal like?
Let's see. Well, the new normal, I'd say, is something that's always been changing for us. So because I'm linked to both the university and to practice, I think we're constantly looking at what we're teaching, how education is changing, but also how that starts to impact the way that we're practicing and vice versa. So I've been really lucky to have that strong link between the two. From things like in 2000, I started teaching digital fabrication, and that was both driven by things that we were interested in our practice, Ply at the time. So we were looking at, we were doing design work, and then we started building some of our own work. And that was a benefit to us to be able to link all the information, geometry, everything that we had in the front end to be able to build something at the back end. So when I started teaching those things, that work was going hand in hand and pushing one another in different ways. I would learn something new because I'd be teaching a class that would find its way into something in our practice. For a new project, we might push something in a new direction, and then I would find myself kind of teaching that and talking to the students about it. Then in probably 2005, 2006, we started looking at parametric modeling and using CATIA and Digital Project. And so that was something that I was pushing at school, and then it wasn't long before I started thinking about how to integrate some of those technologies into our practice. And I'd say there's always been a constantly evolving way of trying to imagine how we push something that we're doing in practice, and always trying to be critical about that and how do we use that as an opportunity for teaching and vice versa. So this idea of the new normal is something it's not like all of a sudden there's a new normal, but it's kind of constantly using the practice as a way to constantly push ourselves to try new things, as opposed to focus on one thing and only do that, I guess.
I think that's really refreshing to hear as a student, that there is such a close tie between the practice and the academic side. So I guess I applaud you for that. That's really nice. So what do you have a favorite material to use in your design? And I guess that would lead into talking about your experiences and techniques with fabrication.
Yeah, I think those two things go hand in hand. And had you asked me a couple of years ago, I think we were doing a lot of work with plywood because the tool or the material was readily available. We understood it. We were able to cut it with CNC routers and things like that at school, and started really digging into the material literally and figuratively, and trying to learn more about how we could push it, how we could make it translucent, how we could make it glow, how we could make it bend. And then we started doing other projects, and there were maybe 2 or 3 projects that we did with sheet metal. And that became an interesting thing where We could laser cut it and we could bend it. It was non-combustible. So we were using that in commercial applications where maybe we couldn't use a combustible material like plywood. And then on things like the Shadow Pavilion, we were also, so maybe I'm not picking one material, but talking about the fact that when we were cutting plywood, we started to be more and more critical and mindful of the waste and how do we get efficient with the cut sheets and how do we think about these things as a way to generate form. And so the plywood, the scraps always just end up in the dumpster. But when we started laser cutting aluminum, we realized that we could recycle the aluminum. And the Shadow Pavilion, as the most extreme example, was a temporary pavilion at the Botanical Garden. And we never really had a budget to dismantle it when it was temporary. And so the deal that we made with the contractor was that they could recycle the whole pavilion and they could get the money from recycling the aluminum to pay for their time to dismantle it and take it apart. And so we only used aluminum in that case, aluminum rivets and aluminum sheet metal. And so the entire thing was able to be recycled. And I think that was a really interesting aspect of thinking about the material, both how we work with it, how we cut it, how we can fold it, how we can bend it, how we can rivet it, but also an idea that we could recycle it at the end of the process. And so lately there's been a lot of more thinking with that type of material.
Interesting. So what are you doing besides straightforward architecture work? How have you branched out?
Yeah, I guess it's a difficult question, or it's a funny question, because I don't know that, I guess that's a question maybe to put it back in terms of the new normal and what is straightforward architecture. I think we've always existed in our practice as seeing every project as an opportunity to think about design, think about how it relates to people that are using it, think about how it relates to a larger body of work. And so we've done a number of projects that are more like interactive art and public art pieces. And we still see that as a form of architecture. There's still a client. There's still a set of users. There's still form. We try and think about how it relates to space, but also trying to integrate new technologies into that, working with Arduinos and LEDs and different sensors and trying to script and program different types of responses. So I'd say that's one trajectory of a small scale type of work where we're doing that. And then the other thing that I've been doing quite a bit is thinking about prefab residential construction. And my role with Blue Homes is thinking, which I'm still operating as an architect, but trying to think about how the technology on the design side relates to the manufacturing, how we think about houses as products, and how those get situated in specific circumstances, either for clients or sites. So again, to me, all of those things seem like straightforward architecture. Maybe to other people it doesn't, but it's always been in that type of framework to think about those things.
This is, I guess, growing off of that answer, how do you see architecture evolving in the future?
That's an even tougher question.
Yeah.
From my own perspective, I know there's a lot of what we've seen in the past is a lot of people beginning to specialize in different ways. And so maybe one thing that I'd like to imagine is people or firms, rather than specializing by program, and so that you do this type of work or that type of work, there might be different type of practices that evolve. And I think we've always imagined ours as a research practice. And so we've never wanted to specialize on doing the same program again and again, although sometimes that happens, but rather to think about, how we push those things. So it's been fabrication, it's been parametric modeling, it's been thinking about scripting and thinking about new technologies. So I just imagine that the tools that we use continue to evolve. And as architects, we inherently embrace these things, or I assume we all do that, but maybe not everyone embraces these things, but we use them, we incorporate them, we try and once we understand them well, we try and push them further. And so there's a constant evolution of learning, kind of pushing a technology, incorporating new technologies or new materials or new ideas and pushing those further. So there's a pretty clear trajectory for me when I understand our profession and how those things relate. So it's difficult to say exactly what happens, but hopefully that process continues.
So, what led you to go off of the more standard straight and narrow and choose to pursue, I guess what you could describe as an alternative practice?
Probably the single most important aspect of that to me was my education, and just having been really inspired by professors that I had in the past that were both teaching and practicing. And so when I was in school, even as an undergrad, having been influenced by people that were doing that, I knew I wanted to teach. Teaching seemed like a really great way to be able to stay connected to the energy of the university, but also to be testing these things out in the real world. And so I think the fact that I teach has played a large role in that, thinking about not only having to do work, and maybe there's a subtle distinction between a kind of practice that is more concerned with service, and you have a client, the client's needs are the most important thing. I think I've always tried to imagine the practice as a way to test ideas and push ideas further, not at the expense of a client, but in service of a client. And so it's not only trying to deliver a project that works for the client, but how does that fit into a larger body of work? How does that allow us to explore a new technology or deploy a new material? And then as far as those things go, I grew up in a small fabrication shop. So from the time that I was like 10 years old, I was in an environment where people were working with materials, things were being built, and so summer vacation, school vacation, I was always in the shop kind of working. And so the other aspect to me, and one of the things that I really try and push when I teach something, I've always found it quite odd for architecture education that we kind of start with the big scale. We say, okay, we look at a site, we develop massing, and only at the very end of the process in school do we figure out what material that thing is made out of. You know, it's like a wireframe at an early stage, or it's always just transparent. And it was the exact opposite when I was growing up. It was always, you could feel the material. When it was being cut in the shop, you could smell, you knew what material was being cut because you could smell it. And so there was always a really strong tactile aspect to that. And so in practice and in a lot of my classes, I try and think about material first or details first, and then how does the form grow out of that type of experimentation and that type of thinking, trying to turn things around a little bit and understand that. And it's taken me a while to realize it, but in school, that process always starts and ends. But in practice, what happens is that you end one project thinking about a certain scale, level of detail, what you learn, and then that's the first thing that you're thinking about when you start the next project. And so there's a really nice continuum in practice to be able to roll things that you learned from a previous project into the next project. And in school, we kind of cut that off because you switch professors and then you start a completely new project and you engage in a new way of thinking. So I think those are the two kind of strong issues about why I've set up the practice that I have and continue to work the way that I do.
What are the influences in your community that support your practice?
Well, I'm in Ann Arbor for most of the time, or that's at least where I'm teaching. And the community here, for the most part, is, at least among, when I think about community, it's the people that I'm working with and my peers and things like that. They're all professors. And so we really rely on one another to push ourselves, to be critical of one another in a productive way, and to have that kind of open dialogue. So community-wise, I've been really lucky to have my colleagues at the university, both within architecture but in other departments as well, and have to kind of push ourselves in different ways. So one of my collaborators, John Marshall's from the School of Art and Design. He's an industrial designer and sculptor, and we've been doing a lot of interactive projects together. And so trying to find and develop communities that way has been important to me.
All right. So now we've got some lighter questions for you, just to get an idea, kind of get to know you a little better as a person. So, what is your favorite word?
My favorite word? I don't know. Let's come back to that. I'll think about it.
What is your favorite hobby or pastime other than architecture?
Let's see. Lately, it's been watching Formula One, and following that. So, both my wife and I have been following that for a couple of years, and I think it's both a pastime and a hobby, but it's also hard to divorce those things from one another. So, thinking about the technology, the speed, the design, all of those things are part of it. The performance is a huge part of that as well.
What is your favorite color?
I guess as architects we have to say black, right? That way we don't have to match our clothes when we wake up in the morning because we haven't slept enough the night before.
Right. What is the most recent book you've read?
There's a few. I never really have an opportunity to read something from beginning to end, but there's a book about thinking. I think it's called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, but it's about how we make the difference between quick decisions that we make versus being able to think about something in the way that we're hardwired to be able to make instinctual decisions, but those aren't always the right decisions. And so I was even just talking to someone about this in the studio. An offshoot of that is that if you ever see EMT drivers or ambulance drivers, they never run into the scene. They always walk. And the idea behind that is that they don't want to raise their adrenaline because they want to make really clear decisions about what's happening because it's a life and death situation. And so they don't want to have to make that fast decision. And so I often, if there's an emergency in the studio or an emergency in the factory, it helps just to say, let's take a deep breath, let's figure things out, and let's think about it before you make that really quick decision.
What profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
I always wanted to design cars. Cool. And I didn't think I didn't have the right guidance counselor in high school. They told me that was mechanical engineering, and I thought about applying to school for that, but I'm not such an engineer type. So architecture, when I walked through the studio spaces, when I was looking at schools and walked through the architecture school, I was like, wow, this is an amazing creative space. But being in Detroit or close to Detroit, there's a lot of car culture and things like that. So the thought has always been, if I win the lottery or I retire at 50, both really far-fetched ideas, then maybe go back to school and think about industrial design or car design.
Would you say you're a Michigan Wolverine?
I probably have to say that now. I've been at Michigan. I came to Michigan in 99. I grew up on the East Coast and moved to Michigan on a 1-year teaching fellowship. And now it's like my 13th year here. So, it seems like I've been here for a while and I'm going to be here for a while.
And finally, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I don't know. Well, I had one of my bosses tell me years ago, and he had a pretty good outlook on life and work in general. And he said, no one on their deathbed ever says, I wish I worked more. So maybe something related to that.
All right. Well, on behalf of AIA Colorado and all of the attendees at the design conference coming up here in November, I'd like to thank you for your time, Karl, and for your answers. And I look forward to hearing you present at the conference.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to coming out and meeting you in person and attending the conference. It looks like it's going to be a lot of fun.
All right. Well, thanks again.
All right. Thanks, David.
Yep.